Hello, my name's Kingsley Singleton and welcome to this Photoshop video lesson from Digital Photo, the UK's best-selling photography and imaging magazine. One of the most common problems facing landscape photographers is how to balance a bright sky and a darker foreground. Inevitably, one will have to be sacrificed, because though the scene looks evenly lit to your eye, your camera's sensor can't deal with the same range of light. It can't cope with bright highlights and dark shadows at the same time, so you end up with an unbalanced photo. One where either the sky is nicely exposed but the foreground is too dark, or the sky is burnt out but you've managed to get the foreground just as you want it. Traditionally, photographers would deal with this using graduated neutral density filters. But in the digital age, it's just as easy to either shoot one raw file and convert it twice, once for the shadow areas and once for the highlights, or simply take two separate exposures from the same position using different shutter speeds and merge them in Photoshop or Elements. You can see how a perfectly balanced landscape photo can be created from two separate raw conversions of the same file using layers and the eraser tool in John's split raw technique, which is on this month's CD and in the magazine. This approach is fine for most landscape images, but here we're going to tackle a slightly more difficult subject where an important part of the scene is projecting into the sky, the castle. This kind of subject is impossible to deal with using the eraser alone because you'll always end up with too fuzzy an edge around the subject or have trouble balancing the light and dark pixels evenly. Fortunately, we can get around this problem using selections and a layer mask, so we end up with a really nicely balanced picture. The selection allows us to precisely fence off some parts of the image when we combine the two pictures, while the layer mask allows us to control any mistakes and fine-tune the effect. So we end up with a really nice, precise, sharp join around the castle here, but on the rest of the landscape we've got a more soft and subtle join between the two exposures. Finally, I'm going to show you how to get rid of any fringing around the subject using the clone stamp tool. And we'll also have a look at straightening up the castle, because in our original shots it's a little bit wonky. We'll also have a look at adding some contrast to the picture, and if I just click through the layers that make up our finished version here, you'll see that we've gone from a starting point here where the sky's too bright. We've then masked in the sky from a separate raw conversion, just straightened things up a little bit using the transform tool, and then added that extra contrast and a little warm-up effect using curves adjustment layers. Okay, so let's minimize our finished version there, and we can take a look at our start images. And as I said, these have been created from a single raw file, and you'll see how to do that in John's video, but in this one we're just going to look at merging the two. So the first thing that we need to do is get both images into the same document. So you first need to see them on screen at the same time, and if you can't, just come up to Window, down to Arrange and pick Cascade. Both of these images, of course, are on this month's cover CD, so you can practice with them yourself. And to go about combining the two images in the same file, first click on the Move tool in the toolbox, and then we'll just click once within castle2.jpg, hold down the Shift key, and then drag it all the way over into castle1. When you do that, you'll see a plus sign next to the cursor, so then you can release that left mouse button and the new photo will drop in on top. We'll just minimize castle2.jpg now, and we can work on this one particular file. Holding down the Shift key just keeps all the pixels perfectly aligned between the two separate exposures, and if I just bring up my Layers palette on screen, you can find yours by coming up to Window and down to Layers. You can see that our original background layer is the landscape with the bright sky, and the one above it, Layer 1, that's our exposure for the sky itself, the one with the dark landscape. So how can we go about merging them together? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is make a selection of all those light pixels in the sky. First, in fact, I'm just going to increase the size of the icons in the Layers palette here, just so that we can get a better look of what's going on. There we go. And then, before we make the selection, I'm going to click on the background layer here in the Layers palette. It'll turn blue to show that it's the active layer, and then come over to the toolbox and select the Magic Wand tool. Up in the options bar, just make sure it's set to New Selection, that the tolerance is around 30, Anti-alias is ticked, and that the contiguous box there is also ticked. And then what we want to do is just click somewhere in the sky, somewhere around here, should do the trick. We'll click, and then the marching ants will appear. It might seem odd that we're getting such a broad selection of that tolerance, looking at the range of tones in the sky there, but of course what we're doing is we're actually creating our selection based on the background layer. That's the one that we've selected there, so that's the one where our magic wand is being used. We can then just hold down Shift on the keyboard just to add to the selection. You'll see up there in the options bar that the Add to Selection icon becomes active when we hold down the Shift key, and then we'll just click on a few more of these areas in the sky, and that's looking okay to me. But before we go on, I'll just zoom in using the space bar, holding that down to bring up the hand tool there so we can drag around in the image, and then once again hold down that Shift key and we'll click just within some of those parts of the castle where we can see through to the sky beyond. Okay, so it looks like our selection has been made pretty well there. The next thing I want to do is just refine the edge of the selection slightly, so we'll click on the aptly named Refine Edge button up there in the options bar, and at the bottom just click on the Quick Mask Preview, and then I'm going to set all of these sliders to 0, the radius slider, the smooth slider there. I'm going to make sure that the feather slider is set to 0.5 pixel, and then I'm also just going to click and drag on the Contract Expand slider and bring that up to about 50%. That's just going to push our selected area into the castle a little bit, just make sure it's really kind of hugging that edge. In fact, it'll probably go over the edge very slightly, just by a fraction. Don't worry, we'll deal with that a little bit later on during this tutorial. But for the moment we can see that all those areas that are outside our selection are covered in red by the quick mask, so we can click OK to exit the Refine Edge palette. The next thing to do before we start masking is just make sure that layer 1 is selected. We can't add a layer mask to the background layer, you see. So once you've clicked on layer 1 and that's turned blue, we can come down to the bottom of the palette and click on the Add Layer Mask icon. And as soon as you do that, just look at that, you'll see that the bright foreground pops through as if by magic. We can come back to a full view with Control and 0, and already our picture is starting to look much better. There's a much better balance between the sky and the landscape. On close inspection though, if we just zoom in using Control and plus on the keyboard, you can see that the selection we made is a little bit choppy. It's not running along those distant hills very well, and around the edge of the castle, if I go in really close, you can see we've created a fringe. Just a sort of a darkening around those stones at the very edge of the building, and they've come through from that darker layer. Don't worry though, we'll be able to deal with both of these things in a moment, and the first one that we're going to have a go at is getting a much better join between the sky and the land. To do this, we need to paint into our mask, and we're going to do that using the brush tool. So come over to the toolbox and select that, then up to the options bar, give the downward facing arrow a click, and we'll set its size to 500 pixels and its hardness to 0. We want a soft edge brush in this case. Moving along, make sure that the mode is set to normal, the opacity is at 100%, and now we're ready to start painting into the mask. Before you do though, just make sure that it's got a rectangle around it in the layers palette. This means that the mask is active rather than the layer, and you'll see what I mean if I click on the layer itself, then we get the rectangle around that. So we want it around the mask. Give that a click. You'll also see at the top of the active window that it says Layer 1, Layer Mask. That means we can start painting into the mask, so making sure that black is the foreground color down there at the bottom of the toolbox. If it isn't, just hit D and then X on the keyboard. We'll just click and start painting onto the image. Now we just want to get rid of that hard line to start with, so we'll paint up along that horizon there. That's looking pretty good. Using the hand tool again, just by pressing the spacebar down, just to scroll around the image. And once we've kind of got rid of that nasty hard edge that was running along the hills, we can then come back up to the options bar, and we can take that opacity down to about 30% and just paint a little bit further up, just creating a really pleasing and gradual join between those two areas. So we'll just come out to a slightly wider view, And as you can see, that's starting to work really well. The black areas of the mask are allowing the lighter pixels from the background layer to show through, while the white areas of the mask are making sure that we can see the darker sky of layer 1. And those grey areas in between, they're just kind of a halfway house between the two really, where we've lowered the opacity of the brush, and that just gives us a nice blend between the two. If you've made a mistake when masking, or you just want to bring a little bit of darkness back into those areas, just press X on the keyboard to swap the foreground colour to white. Make sure you've got the mask selected once again, and then we can just paint into that area, just bringing a little bit of darkness back to those clouds. And yeah, I think that's starting to look really good. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to getting rid of that nasty fringe that was running around the edge of the castle. If we zoom in pretty closely, we can see it. It's quite difficult to avoid when you're masking together two separate exposures, but as I said before, there is a quick and easy way to deal with it, and that's using the clone stamp tool. Let's just select that in the toolbox then, and we'll make sure its size is set to about 50 pixels. And once again, a bit like with our paintbrush, that the hardness is all the way down there at 0. Check that the mode is normal, the opacity is 100%. We'll bring that flow up to 100% there. And then, next to where it says Sample, click on the downward facing arrow and choose Current Layer. Next up, we just need to make sure that we have the layer itself selected, not the mask, so give that a click. You'll see that the rectangle changes sides once again, and then it's a simple matter of just holding down the Alt key to bring up our little sampler target there, clicking on a clean area of the sky, and then just painting right up to the edge of the castle. There you can see immediately that that fringing disappears, and we can just use the space bar there just to navigate our way around the image again, just cloning as we go, getting rid of those dark pixels. So we'll just work our way all the way around the edge of the castle, sampling as we go, and pretty soon we'll have a perfect join between those two exposures. Don't forget these little windows here, we'll just paint over them as well. And because our mask is protecting those lighter stones coming from the castle that's on the background layer, we can be pretty rough with it, and we can just carry on cloning it away. All the way down the other side then, right down to the bottom. And that's our cloning done. Now you may notice that there was a little bush or a tree or something growing out of the top of the castle here, and a few kind of blobs there as well that perhaps weren't in our original selection, the one that our mask was based on. So we'll just dip back into the mask for a moment, give that a click in the layers palette, select the brush tool again. We'll bring that brush size down using the left square bracket key, bring its opacity back up to 100%, making sure that white is still our foreground color. Then we can just click and paint over those offending blobs. And that's a really good example of how flexible using layer masks makes the editing process. You can go back in and change where the mask is applied and how strongly it's applied. It really is a great way of working. Back out to a full view then with Ctrl and 0, and there, in a few short steps, we've managed to successfully combine the two layers, even though there was this pretty difficult subject projecting into the sky. Now that our two exposures are combined, I'm just going to see about straightening up the picture, because the castle has been a little bit distorted by the wide-angle lens that was used to take this picture. So to do that, I'm first going to press Ctrl and Shift and then N on the keyboard, just to create a new layer. We can just call that layer 2 and click OK. And then, holding down the Alt key, come up to Layer and down to Merge Visible. That'll combine our two layers there into a single one above layer 2. And then we can just press Ctrl and minus, just to give ourselves a little bit of space around the canvas there. And then come up to Edit, down to Transform and pick Distort. That brings up the bounding box all the way around the edge of layer 2. And to straighten up those castle walls just a little bit, I'm just going to click and drag that corner handle over, something about there. Kind of looks okay. We'll do the same for the other side in case it's kind of pushing it over that way as well. And that's starting to look okay, but of course we can see the layers below, so we're just going to then click and drag out these center handles just to get rid of those pixels underneath so we can't see them. And if that's making the castle look a little bit more squat than it should be, we can drag out our bottom handle just to sort of return it to its proper dimensions. We can lose a bit of this grass at the bottom anyway, that doesn't really matter. More interested in the rock than the grass. And I think that's looking pretty good, so we can click the tick. And finally, I'm just going to add a little bit of extra contrast and warmth to the picture, just using a curves adjustment layer. So come down to the foot of the palette, click on the Create New Fill or Adjustment Layer icon. That's the half black and half white circle. You'll get a list of options appear. This time we're going to choose Curves. That'll bring up our Curves palette. And then I'm just going to click and drag on the curve, just dragging out a subtle sort of S shape there. And immediately you'll see that if I just click on and off the Preview icon, we go from a picture that kind of looks fine in isolation, but if we see it with the curve applied, I'm sure you'll agree, it looks a lot more striking and punchy. So we can click OK now to exit that palette. I also just want to warm up the picture ever so slightly, so let's add another curves adjustment layer, bringing up the palette, and this time next to channel, I'm going to click and choose red from the list, and then we'll just click and drag that curve up a little bit, just increasing the red in the picture, making it a little bit warmer. And then we'll once again click on that downward facing arrow, select blue from the list, and just drag that curve down ever so slightly, pushing in a little bit more yellow. Click OK, and just like that, we've created a really pleasing landscape image. We've gone from an original version where, yes, the landscape was exposed okay, but the sky was all burnt out. It looks really ugly. You don't want that in your landscapes at all. We've masked in a darker sky from another conversion of our original raw file, just using that layer mask to kind of create a nice crisp join for the castle and a more subtle and graduated one for the hills behind it. We've then straightened everything up using the transform tool and just added a little bit of contrast and warmth using those two curves adjustment layers. And I'm sure you'll agree that the picture looks a lot better for it. So when you're back from your landscape shooting, make sure you give these digital tips a try, because they really will go a long way to creating a landscape image you can be proud of. Okay, I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you next time.